With just 6 weeks left in the NFL season, one record I'm keeping a close eye on is Mike Evans' consecutive 1,000-yard mark. Right now, that streak is in real jeopardy. Heading into Week 13, Evans is sitting at just 403 receiving yards on the season. That means Evans would require 597 receiving yards over the final 6 Buccaneers contests if he were to extend that streak to 11 seasons. Now, we all know that Baker Mayfield knows this, Mike Evans knows this, so if you're looking for fantasy production, we can expect a heavy volume heading towards Mike Evans to close out this campaign. Besides Evans, we are looking at which wide receivers we can trust and which wide receivers are most likely to bust this week. In week number 12, Jordan Addison led the way with 8 catches, 162 yards, and a touchdown, just as we all predicted. We also saw some estranged family members show up at the table as DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Jalen Waddle all contributed to top 12 fantasy finishes. There's plenty of room at the table this week, and there's plenty of room for seconds with RotoBaller's Week 13 starts and sits at the wide receiver position. Let's kick things off with Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets as they take on the Seattle Seahawks. Heading into the Jets' Week 12 bye, Garrett Wilson was the wide receiver 5 for fantasy. Wilson is 5th in receptions with 69, 12th in receiving yards with 722. He's averaging 9.7 targets per game, a 27.6% target share, accounting for an air yard share of 39.1% with an average depth of target of 9.2. Add that all up, that is a recipe for fantasy success. And I dug a little bit deeper into these numbers here. Wilson's .103 receiving first downs per route run. That is 14th in the NFL amongst pass catchers with at least 250 routes there. And that is a metric that you know that I like when we gauge fantasy success. He's also earned a 34.1% first read target share, even with Devontae Adams in town. Over the last 4 weeks, no team has allowed more fantasy production to the wide receiver position than the Seattle Seahawks. That includes limiting the Cardinals' duo of Marvin Harrison Jr. and Michael Wilson to 151 combined yards. Now, over this period, Seattle has allowed 51 receptions, 556 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns in 3 contests, pushing that per game total to 43.57. The second wide receiver I'm starting this week, how about Ladd McConkey of the Los Angeles Chargers as they head into Atlanta to take on the Falcons? Now, I would have included Quentin Johnson in this week's start list. However, if someone were to pass him the dinner rolls, I was afraid that he would likely drop them. Now, let's focus on someone who can catch, and that is McConkey here. Even before Week 12 kickoff here for Monday Night Football, McConkey had already cemented himself as Justin Herbert's top target. In weeks 8 through 11, McConkey was the wide receiver 10 in fantasy, averaging 16.5 fantasy points per contest. Since the bye week, the Chargers have been taking to the air a little bit more frequently, and McConkey, entering Week 12, he's got an average depth of target there of 10.8 while averaging 2.44 yards per route run and bolstering a yards per reception mark at 14.44. Now, McConkey's first downs per route run rate there, that is at .122, and that trails only Amon-Ra St. Brown, Trey McBride, and Stephon Diggs amongst those pass catchers with at least 250 routes. When McConkey steps inside the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, he will face a Falcons secondary that has allowed 37.69 fantasy points per game this season to opposing wideouts and has surrendered 1,676 receiving yards and 15 touchdowns. Those 15 touchdowns, that is the third most in the league this season, with 6 of them coming over the Falcons' last 3 contests, where the Dirty Bird looks more like a flock of turkeys, allowing 42.48 fantasy points per game. And finally, the final wide receiver I'm firing up this week, I'm going back to the well here. I'm going back to Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals as they take on the Minnesota Vikings. After watching both Keenan Allen and DJ Moore of the Bears combine for more than 190 receiving yards, a pair of touchdowns, and more than 45 fantasy points, it would be foolish not to have Marvin Harrison on your radar once again this week. If fantasy managers decide to fade him, I get it. After all, he had just 47 receiving yards there on 3 receptions in a good matchup against the Seattle Seahawks. Now, it's hard to trust this Cardinals offense, but if you can't trust Marvin Harrison Jr. in a matchup against the second friendliest defense towards opposing wide receivers, then when can you trust him? Minnesota has allowed 13 touchdowns and 2,075 receiving yards on 162 receptions this season for an average of 41.1 fantasy points per game. In all likelihood, we will see Harrison Jr., who lines up on the left side of the formation 39% of the time, and on the right side 37% of the time, locked into a one-on-one battle with Stephon Gilmore, who defends the left side 46.5% of the time, and the right side 47% of the snaps. Teams have been targeting Gilmore at a rate of 17.1%, and he has allowed 0.24 fantasy points per route run this season. That shouldn't scare Kyler Murray from attacking this matchup. Now, as far as matchups I'm a little bit afraid of this week, how about Zay Flowers going against the Philadelphia Eagles? Let's give credit where credit is due. Heading into that Week 12 matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers, Zay Flowers was the wide receiver 8 in fantasy, producing a little over 153 points and averaging 13.9 fantasy points per game. Once again, the Ravens wide receiver was solid, catching 5 passes for 62 yards, finishing with just over 11 fantasy points. Flowers isn't what you would call a must-sit option this week, as the Ravens do tend to move him around the formation, as 38% of his routes come from the slot and 40% come on the right side of the formation. Regardless of wherever he goes, he will need to fend off either Quinyon Mitchell or Cooper DeJean, who are regarded amongst the best at their respective positions. Over the last 4 weeks, the Eagles have allowed just 1 receiving touchdown and 279 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers, which caps Flowers' ceiling somewhat. Now there is hope. Cooper Kupp, he was that one guy who caught a touchdown pass and secured 60 receiving yards along the way, while Puka Nacua hauled in 9 passes of his own for 117 yards. Then there is Terry McLaurin, who had just 1 grab for 10 yards, CeeDee Lamb, who had 6 for 21, Brian Thomas Jr., who had 2 for 22 from the previous weeks. As for the next wide receiver that I'm sitting, it's DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks as they take on the New York Jets in New York. Now, no team in the NFL is allowing fewer fantasy points this season than the New York Jets, 26.48. In 11 games thus far, New York has surrendered just 1,340 receiving yards. That is the second fewest, and 7 touchdown receptions, also ranking in the top 5 of fantasy futility. Get that popcorn ready for DK Metcalf versus Sauce Gardner. The last time that we saw these two heavyweights go at it was back in 2022, and it got heated. In that Week 17 showdown, Gardner Minshew, he held Metcalf to just 1 catch for 5 yards. And I remember this because this was during the Fantasy Football Championships. I don't really want to talk about it, but I took a bad beat in that one. Now, one thing that is different this time around is the emergence of Jackson Smith-Njigba, who, in 9 games alongside Metcalf, has 74 targets, 1 fewer than his running mate. Smith-Njigba has also been the better receiver as of late, averaging 26.2 fantasy points per game over the last 3 contests, while averaging 7.7 receptions and 122.3 yards per game. Now, I'm not sure if that helps or hinders Metcalf's ceiling, but I am certainly intrigued. And finally, you are sitting Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders as they take on the Tennessee Titans. Talk about your ultimate fantasy bailout. Terry McLaurin's stat line for week number 12 will read 5 receptions for 102 yards and a touchdown. That sounds fantastic. However, that touchdown and 87 of those yards came with 30 seconds remaining in that game. That one garbage time, catching his garbage time points they count to, I get it. That pushed McLaurin's fantasy numbers from 6.6 fantasy points to 21.2 fantasy points 1 week after McLaurin was locked up and limited to just 2 fantasy points against the Eagles. I, for one, find it difficult to trust McLaurin this week against the Titans, who are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the position at 27.54. They've also limited opposing wide receivers to 8 touchdowns and 1,348 receiving yards, which is the league best. Over the previous Titans 4 weeks, they have allowed just 421 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. Not all fantasy points are created equal, and anything can happen at any time, but lightning striking twice in back-to-back weeks is one thing fantasy managers should not count on. But the one thing that you can count on is the best fantasy football information out there over at RotoBaller.com. Head over there today and check out the RotoBaller Discord channel for all the latest news and analysis. And of course, your start to sit questions with me, Matt Donnelly. We'll see you next time.